A young woman sits in front of a control panel covered in dials and glowing needles. She is barely 20, her hair pinned back under a simple kerchief, her hands steady on the controls. Behind the concrete wall in front of her, enormous magnets hum with a deep vibration that she feels in her chest. The air smells of warm metal, oil, and oil. All she has been told is one instruction: keep the needle in the green. If it drifts, she turns a knob and brings it back. She does not know that every tiny correction she makes is helping to build the most powerful weapon in human history. Years later, when she finally learns the truth, she will say, "I thought I was just watching gauges." August 3rd, 1942. An Army officer, Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Nichols, walks up the marble steps of the United States Treasury Building in Washington, D.C. The war is consuming men, money, and metal at a terrifying pace. Nichols is not there to ask for soldiers or tanks. He is there to ask for silver, an amount so large that it sounds like a mistake. He takes a seat across from Undersecretary of the Treasury Daniel Bell, a serious man who lives in a world of ledgers, troy ounces, and reserves. Nichols has been sent on a mission wrapped in secrecy. He cannot say atomic bomb. He cannot say uranium enrichment. He can only say that what he needs is vital to winning the war. Bell listens carefully. Then he asks the basic question. "How much silver do you need, Colonel?" Nichols answers plainly, 6,000 tons. Silence hangs in the room. A wall clock ticks. Bell looks at Nichols, unsure if he misheard him. "How many troy ounces is that?" Bell asks. In his world, silver is measured that way, not in bulk. Nichols has no idea. He thinks in tons and freight loads, not in the fine units of bullion. Irritated and under pressure, he replies, "I don't know how many troy ounces we need. I know we need 6,000 tons. That is a definite quantity. What difference does it make how we express the quantity?" Bell leans forward, his voice still calm but edged with steel. "Young man, you may think of silver in tons. The Treasury will always think of silver in troy ounces." What Nichols cannot admit is that even this staggering request is only the beginning. As the project grows, 6,000 tons will become nearly 1,400 short tons, over 430 million troy ounces of silver, borrowed from the nation's reserves to build magnets the size of houses. Magnets designed to separate atoms. From here, the story rewinds to explain why this fantasy-sounding request was made at all. Scientists on the Manhattan Project knew that uranium-235 was the key to a fission bomb. When a neutron strikes a uranium-235 nucleus, the atom splits, releasing energy and more neutrons. Those neutrons hit other uranium-235 atoms, and the process repeats in a chain reaction, like a line of dominoes where each falling piece knocks over several more. The problem was that in natural uranium, uranium-235 is incredibly rare, less than 1%. The rest is uranium-238, chemically identical but too stable to sustain a chain reaction. Imagine a jar filled with 1,000 marbles, where only 7 are special, and all of them look the same. Chemistry cannot separate uranium-235 from uranium-38. They react the same way. The only difference is mass. Uranium-235 has 3 fewer neutrons. 3 tiny particles make the difference between an element that can power a bomb and one that cannot. Several possible methods to separate the isotopes were under development: gaseous diffusion, thermal diffusion, centrifuges. All were promising on paper, all were extremely difficult in practice, and no one knew which, if any, would work in time. At the University of California, Berkeley, physicist Ernest Lawrence had a different idea. Lawrence had invented the cyclotron, a machine that used magnetic fields to accelerate charged particles in a circle. When British physicists told him about their own atomic research, he realized an old laboratory technique, mass spectrometry, might be scaled up. The principle was simple to state: turn uranium into ions by giving its atoms an electric charge. Fire those ions into a strong magnetic field. Because uranium-2 is slightly lighter than uranium-2, its ions will curve a little more as they pass through the field. If the magnetic field is strong enough and the setup precise enough, the two kinds of ions will strike different spots. Put collectors in those spots and you can separate the isotopes. Lawrence's team modified a cyclotron and created a small-scale separator. It worked. They could obtain tiny amounts of enriched uranium, but producing milligrams in a lab was a far cry from producing kilograms for a bomb. Scaling up from a tabletop instrument to an industrial plant was like going from a matchstick to a skyscraper. To make Lawrence's idea a reality, the Army's new Manhattan Engineer District decided to build an electromagnetic separation plant in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. It would be called WWII. Inside, hundreds of calutrons, California University cyclotrons turned separators, would be arranged in giant oval racetracks. Each calutron would sit between two huge magnets, the heart of the system. Those magnets required coils of conducting metal, miles and miles of it. The obvious choice was copper. But World War II had turned copper into one of the most precious materials on Earth. Copper wired ships and bombers, radios and radars, factories and telephone networks. The Army could not rip thousands of tons of copper out of the war effort to feed a single experimental plant. The engineers did the math. WWII would need about 5,000 tons of copper for its magnets. That much copper did not exist as spare capacity. They asked, what else could carry electrical current almost as well as copper? The answer was silver. In fact, silver is slightly better. 11 parts silver could do the work of 10 parts copper. Using that ratio, the project would need at least 800 tons of silver. As WWII grew in ambition and design, so did the requirement. It would eventually reach 1,400 short tons. Only one institution had that much silver: the U.S. Treasury. Bell eventually agreed. The Treasury would loan the silver to the War Department under strict conditions. The metal would be weighed to the troy ounce. Every shipment would be escorted. Monthly reports would be required. At the end of the war, as much silver as possible had to be returned. The silver bars, each weighing 1,000 troy ounces, were stored at West Point. To most people, silver was coins, jewelry, and polished serving trays. Here, it looked ordinary. Dull gray bricks stacked on steel shelves under bright lights and armed guard. From West Point, the bars traveled by guarded train to a plant in New Jersey. There, workers melted them in roaring furnaces, the metal glowing white hot as it turned to liquid. The molten silver was poured into molds to form cylindrical billets. Those billets traveled to a rolling mill in Bayway, New Jersey, where hydraulic presses squeezed them through steel dies, extruding them into long strips, about 3 inches wide, less than an inch thick, 40 feet long. The strips left the presses still warm. Solidified silver turned into something like a metallic ribbon. 258 rail cars of these silver strips rolled west under guard to a factory in Milwaukee. There, engineers and machinists at Allis-Chalmers wound the strips into coils. Each coil was huge, weighing several tons, and had to be wound tightly and evenly. A flaw in the winding could create a hot spot and a short circuit in operation. Once wound, the coils were placed into thick steel housings and welded shut. From the outside, nothing about them suggested wealth. They were just big, gray industrial components. When the coils were shipped south to Oak Ridge, they traveled on unguarded flat cars. No one who saw them would have guessed that inside hundreds of those steel shells lay a significant share of the nation's strategic silver. Oak Ridge itself was a secret city. Roads leading in had checkpoints and guards. Barbed wire stretched along the ridges. New houses, dormitories, cafeterias, churches, and theaters sprang up almost overnight. Officially, it was part of the Clinton Engineer Works. Maps did not list its true purpose. Y-12, the electromagnetic plant, sat in a valley surrounded by wooded hills. From the air, the Calutron buildings formed massive ovals. Inside those ovals, in cavernous halls, stood banks of Calutron tanks, steel cylinders arranged in a ring, each flanked by 2 silver-wound magnets taller than a man. Overhead, catwalks ran between the machines. Pipes, cables, and ducts crisscrossed the ceiling. On the floor, thick power lines ran to each magnet. When the Calutrons were running, the sound was like a deep, constant growl. The magnets pulled huge currents of electricity, heating their coils. Cooling water rushed through pipes, hissing and gurgling. Vacuum pumps throbbed as they sucked air from the tanks, trying to create an empty path for the uranium ions. The air was warm and smelled faintly of insulation and machine oil. To operate this machine, the government turned not to more PhDs but to ordinary workers. Tennessee Eastman, the operating contractor, recruited thousands of people, many of them young women fresh out of high school. Some had been working as waitresses, farmhands, or clerks. Many had brothers or husbands overseas. Flyers promised good wages and a chance to help win the war. One of them was a teenager named Gladys Owens. She remembered arriving in Oak Ridge and feeling like she had stepped into another world. Fences, badges, buildings with no names, just numbers. Inside Whitehall, she and other new hires were led to rooms lined with control panels. Each panel had rows of gauges, switches, and small lights. No one told them what the machines did. They were told only that their work was important and that they must not discuss it outside the building. Training was simple and strict. Each dial had a good zone, often shaded green. If the needle moves out of this zone, the instructor said, you turn this knob in this direction until it comes back. Do not ask why. Do not touch anything else. They practiced until the motions were automatic. Armed guards and teens reminded them of secrecy. Mail was censored. Phones were monitored. Curiosity was discouraged. What you don't know, one supervisor said, you can't accidentally tell anyone. At first, the Calutrons fought back. Beams wandered, magnets overheated, vacuum seals failed. Scientists from Berkeley swarmed over the devices, making adjustments, trying different configurations. Slowly, the bugs were worked out. Once the machines became reliable, the limiting factor was not theory, but steady, consistent operation. That was where the young women excelled. Production data showed something surprising. When the Calutrons were operated by Tennessee Eastman's women, output was higher and more stable than when scientists ran them. Ernest Lawrence didn't believe it. A test was arranged. In one racetrack, physicists from his Berkeley team would run the machines. In another, the women operators would run them, following their training to the letter. When the results came in, the women had outproduced the pH. The reason was simple. When a dial on their panel drifted, the women did exactly what they had been taught. They turned the proper knob until the needle returned to the green zone, then they went on to the next dial. The physicists, by contrast, could not resist investigating. Why is it drifting? They wondered. Is there something deeper wrong? They would stop and tinker, slowing deduction. We just did what we were told, Gladys said years later. They wanted that needle in the green. We kept it in the green. 3 shifts a day around the clock, the operators took their places at the panels. 8 hours of standing or sitting in front of the same array of gauges. 8 hours of listening to the hum. 8 hours of small corrections. The work was repetitive, but they took pride in doing it well. They knew, even if they didn't know the details, that what they were doing mattered. While they worked, the silver in the magnets did its job silent and unseen. Current surged through the coils, creating magnetic fields strong enough to bend the paths of fast-moving ions. Inside the vacuum tanks, a source of uranium tetrachloride was heated until it produced vapor. That vapor was bombarded with electrons, turning neutral atoms into positively charged ions. Those ions flew through a slit into the magnetic field and curved according to their mass. Collectors placed at just the right locations caught the desired uranium-235 little by little. On the outside, it looked like nothing was happening, just needles twitching, numbers changing slightly, operators making tiny adjustments. On the inside, atoms were being sorted by weight. By early 1948, the combined efforts of WWII and other enrichment plants had produced enough uranium-235 to assemble a weapon, about 64 kilograms, roughly the weight of an average adult of highly enriched uranium, would serve as the core of a new kind of bomb. On August 6, 1940, news crackled over radios across the United States. An American bomber had dropped a single bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. The city was largely destroyed. President Truman announced that the bomb was atomic, harnessing the basic power of the universe. In Oak Ridge, workers stopped to listen. Some cheered, some stared quietly, some put pieces together. Atomic, uranium, a secret plant that worked with uranium compounds. Years later, many would say that was the first time they had any real sense of what they had been part of. I just stood there, one former operator recalled, and thought, my God, that's what we were doing. I was proud the war might be ending. I was scared by what we'd helped make. The script does not try to tell the viewer or what to think, but it acknowledges the moral weight. The bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed tens of thousands immediately, and many more from burns and radiation. Some historians argue they prevented an even bloodier invasion of Japan. Others question whether both bombs were necessary or whether different choices could have been made. For the people at Oak Ridge, the war was suddenly, abruptly, almost over. After Japan's surrender, the role of Y12 changed. Electromagnetic separation was too energy-hungry and labor-intensive for long-term production. Gaseous diffusion plants took over the job of enriching uranium. The calutrons at Y12 were gradually shut down. The magnets cooled. The hum stopped. Now the focus shifted back to the silver. Dismantling the calutrons was done with the same care as building them. Coils were removed from their housings. Silver strips, now darkened from heat and time, were unwound, cleaned, and inspected. Everything was weighed, every shipment was recorded, the silver was melted back into bars and returned to Treasury control. Workers pulled up floorboards and burned them to recover tiny amounts of silver dust. They scraped residue from pipes and fittings. They washed surfaces and processed the wash liquids chemically. In the end, out of 14 million troy ounces loaned, only a small fraction, about 1 part in 3,000, was truly lost. To Bell and his successors at the Treasury, this was close enough to a miracle. By May, the last of the silver was formally replaced with copper, and the long account was finally closed. The story ends not with an explosion, but with reflection. The great machines are gone. The secret city has become an ordinary one. Y12's mission has changed with the decades, from enrichment to stewardship of a nuclear arsenal that many hope will never be used. The technology of electromagnetic separation lives on in peaceful tools for science, medicine, and industry. And yet, the core of the story is not metal or machinery. It is people. Kenneth Nichols, who walked a tightrope of secrecy, logistics, and responsibility, asking a country to trust him with its treasure. Daniel Bell, who signed it off on one of the most unusual loans in American history. Ernest Lawrence, whose curiosity pushed instruments beyond their expected scale. Men and women whose names never appeared in headlines, who soldered joints, tightened bolts, wound coils, and signed for shipments. And above all, the operators like Gladys, who sat before panels of dials and lights, doing work they could not fully understand, trusting that their small actions mattered. Their service was not glamorous. It did not make for posters or parades. But without their patience and focus, the needles would not have stayed in the green, the beams would have wandered, and the enriched uranium might never have reached the quantities needed. History, the narrator suggests, often looks like this when you zoom in. Not like a single crisp photograph of a famous figure at a podium, but like a mosaic of millions of small, deliberate actions by people who showed up, did their jobs, and went home tired. Their tools might be rifles, wrenches, typewriters, or in this case, knobs and dials on a mysterious panel. The silver went back to its vaults. The war ended. The world entered the uneasy new age that those silver coils had helped create. But the deeper legacy is a reminder of what human beings can do under pressure, solve problems that seem impossible, and carry heavy moral burdens that may take a lifetime to fully understand.